Okay, hello everyone. Let me turn on the captions here. Okay, perfect. All right. Welcome to the Police Accountability Board's public input session for our proposal for change regarding RPD protest policies. Will Cleveland, one of our data analysts who has conducted this review, is going to present it to you. We will be able to see any chats or questions. So if you submit them either on Twitter, Facebook, or YouTube, we will be able to see that and try to respond. We'll also be leaving some room for questions as well. However, if you are unable or unwilling, you want to maybe review the policy a little more before offering feedback, we'll include some other options for you in the chat as well as during the presentation. But if you have questions, you can also go to rockpab.org/policy-and-oversight, where you can see this proposal in full and also find the link for feedback there as well. So without further ado, we will hand it over to Will and take it away.
Can you enable screen sharing, Vanessa? You're also muted.
Yes, I can. And yes, I was. Hold on one second.
Thank you.
Yes, I can. Try.
Everyone see that okay? There we go. Everyone can see that okay?
Yes.
Beautiful. All right. First of all, thank you for joining us. My name is Will Cleveland. I'm an oversight manager within the Policy and Oversight Division of the Rochester Police Accountability Board. Thank you for joining us. Today, we're going to be discussing our latest project, which is a proposal for change that looks at the Rochester Police Department's protest policies, or the policies rather, for policing protests and mass gathering, all related to General Order 680. I'm going to be flipping through a PowerPoint presentation here and then leaving some areas for people to ask questions. So I look forward to having this conversation with you guys. All right, so first of all, this is the agenda for what we're going to be discussing. First of all, we're going to be looking at the background, basically how we got here, the primary goals of this proposal, and then the timeline for the proposals and policies, both from us and from RPD. And then if you'll notice, each of the slides, or at least the majority of the slides, has pictures from the protest, specifically from 2020, all taken by myself when I was still working as a journalist for the Democratic Chronicle. So I was hoping to add a little bit of a visual element to this. So that's the reasoning for that. And if you've joined us before, you probably already know this, but according to Section 18 of the city charter, as well as bylaws for our board, we have two different avenues for investigation within the Policy and Oversight Division. The first one is an oversight investigation. So that's designed to do a lot of research, collect, analyze, and then present what we found out. It doesn't offer recommendations. And then the second one, which is what we're going to be embarking on today, is known as proposal for change. And the proposal for change, it involves a lot of the same steps as an oversight investigation, but the major difference is that it offers recommendations, and then those recommendations are then delivered to elected leaders, the public, RPD, the Locust Club, and we ask for feedback. So in April 2023, so last year, our board voted to execute this duty, specifically with this oversight investigation. For this proposal for change that looks at protest policies. And we hope that it's a community and data-driven process where we make formal recommendations to RPD. Once it's approved by our board, it's then sent to all of the people I already hit on, including the police chief. And according to our charter, and which is part of the local law, the chief is then given 30 days to respond to this. We publish those responses, and the chief can either agree or disagree, but it has to include some sort of explanation for that. And if the chief does agree, it needs to include a timeline for when those recommendations will be rolled out or enacted rather. All right, we'll start at the beginning. This all really starts in the spring of 2020. First was, or at least first publicly, was the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, Minnesota. If you remember, there were 4 officers who were convicted in relation to Mr. Floyd's death, including Officer Derek Chauvin, who was charged and then convicted of murder, while he was being held down by police officers there. And then shortly after that, or at least actually before that, was the police-involved death of Daniel Prude that involved 7 Rochester police officers that were suspended as a result of this incident. But Mr. Prude encountered officers during a mental health breakdown on March 23rd, 2020, over on Jefferson Avenue in the city's 19th Ward. He was held down and then died 7 days later as a result of positional asphyxia, according to findings from the medical examiner. His case was then presented to a specially impaneled grand jury. The grand jury that was impaneled by the state attorney general's office determined that there would be no charges brought against any of the officers involved. So that led to a series of protests. If you remember, Mr. Prude's death didn't become public until about 5 to 6 months later, when his family, attorneys, and also some activists stood on Rochester City Hall steps and kind of alerted everyone to what had happened. So once that happened, there was a series of protests, specifically in September 2020, for about 4 to 5 weeks straight. Involved many incidents near the public safety building, over on J Street, and a number of different areas. But that led to RPD then saying that they were going to come out with a new protest policy. That was General Order 680. They formally announced the policy in April 2022. Our division within the PAB issued a response to that in May 2022. That can be reviewed and read on our website, like Vanessa said, rockpab.org. There's a tab right at the top for the Policy and Oversight Division. And then the 680, or the protest policy, was formally published and released to the public in July 2022. And then in relation to all of this, there's an ongoing federal class action suit known as Hall v. Warren. You can review that case if you search it on courtlistener.com. But basically, it's a class action suit that involves a number of named plaintiffs rather. Some groups that were involved, the National Lawyers Guild. And in that suit, they're claiming that, they're looking for a federal monitor to come in, and then stating that RPD's policies and practices with regard to use of force, racially biased policing, and policing of demonstrations really needs to be examined. All right, so once we finished our comparative analysis, actually, before I jump into the primary goals here, like to see if you guys have any questions, or I'd also like to offer you a chance to speak about your role or your experiences during the protests. So this will probably be a little easier when we're in person, but if anyone was involved in the protest or present, I'd love to hear about your experiences, because the way we make this proposal and these recommendations stronger is by listening to the community. So if anyone would like to talk about their experiences, now would be a good time to do that. But if you don't feel like chiming in at this point, I'll note that, as Vanessa stated already, we're going to have a Microsoft Forms page where you're welcome to write about your experiences, because, like I said, I'd like to really hear about those.
I don't have anybody leaving comments in the chat now, but I will let you know if we do get any feedback regarding experiences or questions.
Perfect.
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you. So then jumping back into our 5th slide here, which is our primary goals. After this research and comparative analysis, the PAB identified 3 areas for further growth. So 3 areas where we'd really like to see RPD improve and streamline and just work to better its protest policy or General Order 680. I'm going to kind of use those interchangeably, but it's probably easier if I just call it protest policy since General Orders. Anyways, okay, so the 3 areas we identified are RPD's planning, communication, and proportionality during these mass gatherings. So that would be, the communication with the public, communication with partner agencies, planning, and then proportionality, meaning, everything having an equal and opposite reaction, really. Making sure that RPD's response to these gatherings is proportional to what's actually happening. Then the second would be the weapons and tactics used by RPD during these responses. That will include everything from pepper balls to riot gear, riot shields, the LRAD, things like that. And then the third area would be the police accountability mechanisms and measures. So these would be the transparent and accountability measures in place that would allow both the community, elected officials, and RPD to really kind of keep a handle and keep a view on what's going on. And we'll jump right into 680 itself. So instead of me just regurgitating the 8-page policy, 8-page general order, I think it's just easiest for me to kind of show you what's in the introduction, and then we'll talk about bits and pieces as we go on. And if you haven't, I would encourage everyone to go to RPD's open data portal. You can easily just Google for RPD open data portal. It'll take you to a website. It's a great spot where you can view all of RPD's general orders, which contains all of their directives, all their training bulletins, information on personnel, information on the number of crimes, where things are happening, like an incident map, things like that. So it's a really helpful tool, and I recommend that you take a few minutes, if you haven't, to check it out and to kind of dive around and dig around in there to see what it offers. So General Order 680, which is protest and mass gatherings policy, promises the following things. It says the police will engage in proactive community engagement with involved groups. So this means they will have discussions with people who would potentially be involved in these protests, maybe impacted groups, different community groups, whatever. So that promises to have a better dialogue with those groups. One of the major issues there being a lot of these protests are specifically against policing tactics or policing measures. So some of these groups might be reticent to speak with the police. So I would like to see some more clarification on how RPD would go about fixing that, or mending those bridges, or making that a little bit better. It also promises robust information sharing among RPD and its partner agencies. So in the case of these protests, the two dominant or two most involved partner agencies were the Monroe County Sheriff's Office and the New York State Police. The policy also promises to give protesters space to exercise their First Amendment rights, while officers kind of have this balancing act to perform where they are, they're asked to both protect protesters and ensure public safety. That can include protecting different buildings or property. We saw that in the case of the public safety building, or RPD's special operations unit that's over there on the city's west side, where some of the protests were. It also says that RPD will allow outdoor demonstrations to run their course without interference. And then it promises that officers will display a neutral position, remain patient, practice de-escalation where appropriate. So those are kind of the major promises in the introduction for 680. Before we jump to the next slide, I'd like to again offer some space for folks to ask any questions or offer any observations.
We're good.
Cool. Okay, jumping into the first area that we identified for further growth, being planning, communication, and proportionality. This really involves a lot of the sections related to how RPD will devise an operational plan. So how they will come up with the plan that they will put in place for their response to any protest or mass gatherings. So that chain kind of looks like this. First, they will draft a plan. Then that plan then must be approved by either the police chief or the deputy chief of operations. So the second in command within the department, at least in that branch of RPD. Once that plan gains approval from the chief or the deputy chief, it is then delivered to corporation counsel. So the city's chief attorney, the attorney then has to approve the plan. Some of the other parts of planning must include establishing a chain of command and identifying the supervisor who can authorize use of force. We'll talk a little bit more about use of force as we move forward, but those are some of the areas contained within 680 or the protest policy, where RPD talks about what they're going to do to better plan, and then also make sure that it's the right response for what they're dealing with. And then I'll look at our recommendations here, and then once we look at recommendations, I'll again open it up for questions. So PAB, and it goes into greater detail within the policy paper that we have, the recommendations that we publish on our website. But among other things, it stresses the importance of a tiered, tailored response. So it wants to make sure that what the response is proportional to what is happening, but also that it fits what is happening. So it doesn't want to have RPD. We want to make sure that RPD doesn't overreact or does something that doesn't really fit the character of what's going on. So that's important, and obviously why we're stressing the importance of that tiered and tailored response. The second recommendation, major recommendation really, is to better define the factors for crowd dispersal orders. There are instances, specifically in the 2020 protest, where you could hear officers over the loudspeaker, which in this case was the LRAD, where they were, directing people that, this was an unlawful gathering and that they were requesting people to leave the area immediately. So we want to make sure that there's better definitions and better factors, a better definition of the factors that RPD would take into account when they issue these crowd dispersal orders. So it's important for there to be more specificity there, and that specificity is spelled out and drafted out so folks in the public can review what's going on. In our analysis of all the general orders, 680, the protest policy is described as an overarching or superseding policy. So it's supposed to be the policy that takes precedence over all of the other directives. But we found numerous instances within other general orders where there are either contradictions or areas within the pre-existing general orders that don't agree or aren't consistent with what is in this protest policy. So we really would like to see RPD update those existing policies to make sure that everything has the unified message and that everything is in agreement and consistent with what is in this protest policy. The next recommendation involves the implementation of a version control system. So we tracked this, or came up with this recommendation after reviewing what is done in Austin, Texas. The Austin Police Department has what they call a version control system. So basically it's that every time a policy is updated, you can see when it was updated, and you can also see what specific areas were updated, and then what the policy previously said. So in the case of RPD at this point, you can only see the policy as it exists right now. You can't see what has been changed, what's been deleted, what's been added. It'll only tell you like when the policy was first published, and then it'll give you a date for when it was updated, but it won't show you what was updated. So we'd like to see there be a version control system in there so we would better be able to track changes. And it would add, just another layer of transparency and accountability, where the public could then see what changes RPD was making. And, if they weren't on board with something that was changed, voice some concerns or anything like that. So that's why it's important for us and the public to be able to track those changes in policies. And then the final recommendation is enhancing the use of social media. We saw in a number of different jurisdictions that we studied, these jurisdictions, these municipalities, these departments really did a great job of communicating with the public via social media. So it's like they did a little bit of it in 2020, but have kind of abandoned it since then. But they would say like the protest is approaching this intersection, or we are asking people to avoid this area. So just things like that would just do a better job of communicating to the public what's going on. But it would also be something that protesters could follow just to see what's going on with the police department. So we would like to recommend that there be an enhanced use of social media. And before we jump into our second area of improvement, or encouraged improvement rather, I'd like to again open this up for questions. So anything you guys might have questions about here, I'm happy to listen and hopefully provide some feedback.
Hold on one second. So I'm going to paraphrase this question just a little bit, just because there's multiple parts. But one commenter says in the last 3 years, there haven't been any large scale protests. So I guess a question would be like, why bring this up now? Or like, what is the importance of settling this right now?
Sure. That's a great question. It's a fair point. It's really kind of, so really the professional staff, that's here to support the board of the PAB. We've only been in place for most of us less than 2 years. So a lot of this is us finishing work that our board started a number of years ago, and just doing it to its full completion. There was a volunteer board wasn't able to do a lot of the things that we're able to do because they don't have the time, because they all have day jobs or other responsibilities. So a lot of it was completing that. So they had oversight investigation hearings into these protests a number of years ago that can still be viewed on the Rock PAB YouTube page. So that's one of the major things. But the second thing is we want to make sure that this policy is updated and in place for anything that might happen. Like there's obviously no predicting when there might be a next series of protest and and potentially chaotic and interplay between the police and the public. So we want to make sure that these policies that are in place now, while representing a great step forward, they could be updated to improve, we think, in a number of areas that we highlighted. But so we want to make sure that these are updated so when the next protest does happen, because I mean there's decades of history of protests in the city of Rochester specifically, whether it's stuff in the 1960s, this 1970s, there was a number of stuff in the 70s and 80s and 90s. I'm just listing the decades at this point, but so there's decades of history of protest, and there's no real telling when they might happen. So it's important to continue this conversation just because we want to make sure that these policies are as fair and equitable and updated as they need to be, just in case something does happen.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, the rest of the question has to do with the number of investigations and complaints and stuff like that. So since we're focusing specifically on policy and oversight and not our investigations division, and since this specifically is a lot of information about our policy recommendation for protests, I'll reserve the answer for that in the chat. And it looks like it's on YouTube. So I'll answer that there. But other than that, we can move on.
Awesome. Thank you for the good question. I appreciate it. All right, jumping into our second area of improvement, or second area we'd like to see the focus on. That focuses on the weapons and tactics that were employed during these protests. So looking specifically at General Order 680, the protest policy, it bans in most instances, as I have in parentheses there, the use of tear gas, flashbangs, LRADs, which is the long range acoustical device. So the giant loudspeaker that can either be used to emit really loud tones or, like I said, be used as kind of a public address system. So it limits the use of that, and then also bans the use of kettling. So just a quick aside, kettling is a tactic where police or any agency really kind of cordons off protesters or any group that's gathered, and doesn't allow them to have means to exit or means to leave an area or the premises. So specifically, we saw this. It was either on the second or third night of the protest back in September 2020, over on the Court Street Bridge. There were numerous orders for protesters to leave the area, but according to the allegations and then also media observations, the allegations in that lawsuit that we spoke about earlier, RPD used this kettling technique to keep protesters from leaving, and then there were various allegations as a result of that. So this General Order 680, the protest policy, bans the use of kettling. It also has restrictions on the use of pepper balls, which were employed quite a bit during the first few nights of the protest. Media reports said that there were over 6,000 pepper balls that were fired in the first few nights of the protest. I think that was September 2nd through September 5th or 6th, 2020. And then you'll remember that the state police brought their canine, brought their dog unit, whatever you'd like to call it, to the protest. So this reiterates that police use of canines at protests is banned. And as a reminder, RPD's actually had a ban on the use of canines for these instances since 2015. And that'll help us get into a later discussion about mutual aid agreements that we're going to touch on in a few minutes. I'm going to jump into our recommendations, then I'll again open it up for questions. All right, so these are the recommendations that we came up with. Like we were talking about earlier, we'd like to see the general orders or the directives remove ambiguities in the language and making sure that they all contain consistent instructions or directives for the officers. Like we said with 680, with the protest policy being the superseding policy, we'd like to make sure that we recommend that RPD must make sure that all the policies are in compliance with each other, and make sure that there aren't any contradictions within it, specifically with the protest policy as the superseding policy. We also recommend eliminating the potential for officer discretion for the use of tear gas, LRAD, and kettling. There's instances in the policy where it kind of differentiates between outside and inside. So I think if specifically for tear gas, it bans the use of tear gas outside, but it doesn't talk about what it would happen if it was potentially used inside, or what instances where officers might have discretion or might want to use tear gas inside. So we want to make sure that there's eliminates the potential for usage in all instances, not just whether it's inside or outside. Also, it talks about the LRAD being potentially used as just a public address system, and eliminating it for the loudest frequencies. We recommend that LRAD's not used at all. There's other safer things that can be used, whether it's a bullhorn or some sort of speaker system that could really do wonders and help. I shouldn't say do wonders, that it could really work just as effectively as an LRAD. And kettling specifically, it doesn't talk about kettling in 680. It doesn't use that term, but there are other general orders that we found where there are instances where techniques are described that could be construed as kettling. So we want to make sure that those instances are removed to make sure that everything follows along with what is recommended in 680, the protest policy. We want to also recommend the tightening and clarification of language surrounding the uses of pepper balls, the uses of the pepper ball launching system. There's a separate manual that dictates how that's used. We want to make sure those are all in accordance with each other, and just tighten up some of the language in there. And then the final recommendation would be the formalization and the formalization and publicizing of mutual aid agreements. So a mutual aid agreement in this case would be the agreement where, like, say, the Monroe County Sheriff's Office comes into the city of Rochester and is assisting RPD in some sort of investigation, or in this case, um, crowd dispersal or something related to protest. There are no, at least as far as we know, there are no written mutual aid agreements at this point. There's nothing available on RPD's open data portal. And then through the use of two foils, both through the Monroe County Sheriff's Office and the New York State Police, we were able to determine that there are no written agreements, or in the case of the Sheriff's Office, they told us that there was nothing available for them to turn over to us because nothing exists. So we would like to see those orders drafted and then followed and presented to the public for comment. This is something we took from Denver's oversight agency that recommended that these agreements be better and in place, and to make sure that everyone's following the same set of rules. You don't want, it's just important that you don't have officers coming from an outside agency and acting in a way that doesn't stand in agreement with what officers who are already here are supposed to follow. So we want to make sure that everyone's following the same set of guidelines. And this is a good point for questions too. So I'd like to again open it up and offer the chance to ask any questions.
We're good for now.
Thank you. All right, we're moving into the third area for improvement that we highlighted, or that we selected rather. These will be the accountability mechanisms. So the ways in which the public can kind of keep an eye on what's going on. In this case, the three areas where the protest policy highlights are both use of body-worn cameras during protest, whether officers are identifiable. That relates to the use of name tags or badges that were covered up at some points in the protest. We'll talk about that a little bit more in our recommendations. And then the final area would be the dealings with the press, legal observers, and medics. All right, so the recommendations that we were able to come up with and draft and deliver. We recommend that all officers, regardless of their rank, status, position, whatever, be required to wear body-worn cameras during protests and mass gatherings. I think it's important that no one is exempt from that policy. Want to make sure that everyone is following the same rules again, and just make sure that there's a way for the public to keep an eye on what's going on, but it's also a good way for the officers to to hold themselves accountable. Say there's an allegation of something happening, and if there's body-worn camera footage and it shows that this didn't happen, it's also a way for officers to protect themselves. So that's why we feel that the use of body-worn cameras is very important. We'd also recommend that the supervisor is assigned to regularly conduct spot checks, comparisons of body-worn camera footage, and rosters. So this would make sure that every officer is recording, that every officer is following the same criteria. We'd also like to see criteria published for command staff who allow officers to replace their nameplates with designated protest numbers. So if you recall, during the 2020 protest, there were instances where officers were covering up their name tags because there were allegations of doxing and other just general safety concerns. Specifically, that's what former Chief Cynthia Harriet Sullivan talked about. And so in this case, we recommend that officers who are replacing their name tags be then provided with designated protest numbers. So these numbers would be easily viewable, easily identifiable, and it would allow a member of the public to just take note of the number of the officer they were dealing with, and then consult, whether it's a database or like a records request, but being able to determine who they were dealing with. Then we move on to collecting input from the media, legal observers, and medics, and the policies that are used to dictate how officers deal with them. These are supposed to be the unbiased, non-biased participants. You know, the people who are there to do a different sort of job, whether it's to report, whether it's to, you know, observe. The legal observers wearing their, you know, their bright orange hats there, and the medics were present to help anyone who might be injured. So we also recommend that these observers be exempt from dispersal orders. I think that's very important to highlight. And then the final recommendation comes from an area of the policy that was talked about in the original press release back in April 2022, and it deals with officers should not attempt to interfere with individuals who are legally recording. So this dates back to a specific incident of eviction where police were present and there were numerous people who were arrested, and a few of them were recording. And we want to make sure that there's just a reminder that, hey, you know, people have a right to record these dealings, especially if they're, you know, standing on public property or whatever. So that's just a reiteration, and we'd like to see that formalized and just better written about the policy. So again, this is a good spot to stop and see if there's any questions.
We're good to go.
Thank you. We're about at the end here. All right, so the summary, just to reiterate, three main areas that we looked at. We talked about the recommendations that were offered. So the three main areas again being the planning, communication, and proportionality, the weapons and tactics, and the accountability mechanisms and measures. I'd like to again reiterate that I would love to hear about your experience during the 2020 Black Lives Matter protests in Rochester. Feel free to either provide feedback in the chat here or to offer it via our Microsoft Forms or email. And then the final thing is just what additions or changes, removals, edits, whatever. What would you like to see added to this this proposal? It might be hard to make that determination at this point, but I would love to see you guys read the proposal thoroughly and get back to me and offer any suggestions, because I want to make sure this is something that is indicative and mirrors what the public is really requesting. Thank you. There's my contact information. Can be reached at william.cleveland@cityofrochester.gov. You can also visit our website, rockpab.org, and that's an easy place. If you go to the Policy and Oversight tab, you can check out all of the work we have currently. We'll have some more proposals that are published on there soon. If you want some more information about some of the other proposals for change that we've completed, or just want to view the status of some of them, particularly like our recent right to know proposal that was presented to the public, but then also sent to RPD Chief Smith, and Chief Smith offered his response to that, so you can kind of get a better idea of what a potential police response might look like. So that's also published in that Policy and Oversight tab in the Rock PAB website.
All right, thank you so much, Will. Again, if anybody would like to view this video again, it'll be available on our YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter pages. It will be pinned to the top of those pages to make it easier for you to view. And we'll also be holding 3 additional community input sessions, one on the 15th, the 22nd, or the 8th, the 15th, and the 22nd, sorry. Those will be in person. And we will be offering refreshments for folks who attend during those hours from 6 o'clock, starting at 6 o'clock. And we'll also be offering complimentary bus passes to compensate people for their time and their opinions. And so other than that, you can find that information on our events section of our website if you go to rockpab.org/get involved. Other than that, we are all set. Thank you, Will, again, and thank you folks for participating. Bye.